There's a photograph, not a famous one, not the kind you see in history books, just a small, slightly blurred picture taken by a tourist outside St. James's Palace in the summer of 1987. In it, a little boy in a red knitted jumper is leaning out of a car window, waving. Not the practiced, elbow wrist royal wave you learn. Not the stiff, dignified acknowledgement of a family bred for composure. Just a kid, arm out the window, fingers spread wide, grinning at absolutely nobody in particular. That photograph has lived in a shoebox in Margaret Holloway's attic in Kensington for almost 40 years. She was 23 when she took it. She remembers the exact moment, not because she knew who the boy was, she didn't, not at first, but because he waved at her specifically. He looked right at me, she told her daughter once. Not past me, the way they usually do. Right at me. Like I was someone he recognized. He wasn't 5 years old yet. Let me take you back. London in the summer of 1987 had a particular smell, exhaust fumes and cut grass and the faint sweetness of ice cream carts that appeared whenever the temperature climbed above 18 degrees, which it did, briefly, for about 11 days in July. The tourists were out in their particular London uniform, maps held upside down, cameras strapped across chests, sensible shoes that would blister by afternoon. Margaret had come from Leeds 2 weeks earlier to start a secretarial position near Whitehall. She was killing his Saturday morning the way newcomers to London always do, walking slowly past things that looked important, taking photographs of gates and pigeons and the backs of policemen's helmets, feeling simultaneously thrilled and slightly overwhelmed by the sheer density of the city. She had turned down the mall from St. James's Park, following the path along the edge of the road, when the small motorcade came through. Not a dramatic motorcade. 2 cars. A lead vehicle, quiet and dark, and then a larger car behind it, moving on hurriedly in the way that official vehicles move, like they own the specific strip of tarmac they are currently occupying. The crowd along the road, 15 people, maybe 20, went still in that instinctive way people do when something official passes. The way your body registers authority before your brain catches up. The larger car slowed slightly at a pedestrian crossing. And the window came down. He was small. That's the first thing Margaret noticed. Small the way all 5-year-olds are small, contained in their own world, still at the age where everything outside a car window was worthy of sustained interest. He had pressed himself against the glass, watching the park, and then, as the car slowed, he had turned and seen the people standing along the road. His face did something uncomplicated. It lit up. The wave was immediate. Instinctive. The kind of wave you give a friend you've spotted across a room, not the kind you perform for a camera. Margaret waved back before she knew she was doing it. And then, she said, he laughed. Just laughed. This little laugh. Because someone had actually waved back, I think. Like he hadn't expected it. The car moved on. Margaret stood on the pavement with her camera still warm from taking the photograph, and it took her another 40 seconds before she turned to the woman beside her and asked, hesitantly, who was that? The woman looked at her like she had asked something extraordinary. That's the young prince, she said. That's William. There are 1,000 stories like this one. Not in the history books. Not in the official biographies, with their measured language and careful sequencing of public appearances. But, in the shoeboxes and the yellowed notebooks and the memories of ordinary people who were simply standing in the right place at the right moment and found themselves completely undone by a small child doing something completely ordinary. This is one version of those stories. This is the story of who William was before he understood what being William meant. Princess Diana gave an interview once, 1985, William was barely 3, where she was asked what surprised her most about motherhood. She paused. Not the diplomatic pause. The real one, where someone is actually thinking. He talks to everyone, she said. Everyone. The gardener. The woman who delivers the post. I took him to a shop last week and he spent 10 minutes asking the man behind the counter about his shoes. She laughed, the kind of laugh that has something tender underneath it. His shoes. He wanted to know if they hurt. The interviewer smiled and moved on to the next question. But, that detail, he wanted to know if they hurt, that detail lodged itself in the people who heard it. Because it said something about the child that no official portrait could. He was watching people. Not the way royals are trained to watch, carefully, with appropriate acknowledgement, but the way children watch when they are genuinely curious, before anyone has told them which people are worth being curious about. Kensington Palace in the 1980s was not the polished institution it would later become. There were staff who had been there for decades, who moved through the long corridors with the particular quiet efficiency of people who have learned that the walls hear everything. And there were newer staff, younger, sometimes barely older than the century, who were still adjusting to the weight of the place. One of them, a young footman named Gerald, started work there in the autumn of 1986. He was 22. He was from a small town in Worcestershire. He had never been inside anything larger than the Odeon Cinema before he walked through the staff entrance at Kensington Palace for his orientation. He was lost within the first 10 minutes. Not metaphorically. Physically lost. He had taken a wrong turn down a corridor that he was fairly certain was not on the map he'd been given, and he was standing in front of a door that was definitely not the door he was looking for, holding a tray he was supposed to have delivered 8 minutes ago, trying to work out whether turning around would make things better or worse. The door opened. William looked up at him. Gerald looked down at William. They regarded each other for a moment with equal uncertainty. "You're lost," William said. It wasn't unkind. It was the observation of a 4-year-old who had probably watched quite a few people get lost in this corridor. "I am," Gerald said. "Where are you trying to go?" Gerald told him. William considered this with the gravity of a child who has recently been trusted with information about the layout of the building and wishes to demonstrate that this trust was not misplaced. "Go back that way," he said, pointing. "And then, you go past the tall clock. And then, there's a door that smells funny and you don't want that one. The one next to it." Gerald thanked him. He found the room. The tray was delivered only 12 minutes late, which, under the circumstances, he felt was acceptable. He told that story at his retirement dinner, 30 years later. He told it the way people tell stories that they've carried a long time, carefully, making sure to get the details right. The tall clock. The door that smells funny. "I don't know if he remembered it," Gerald said. "I don't know if it meant anything to him. But I've thought about it my whole career. A 4-year-old, standing in a doorway, giving me directions like it was the most natural thing in the world." He paused. He wasn't showing off. He just didn't want me to be lost. There is a particular kind of childhood that is never quite private. Every photograph is managed. Every appearance is considered. The world watches, and the watching shapes the child in ways that are invisible until, years later, someone tries to trace the lines back to their origin. But childhood has a way of escaping. It slips through the formal portraits in a grin that's a fraction too wide, too real, too unguarded. It appears in the eyewitness accounts of people who were standing in the right place on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. It lives in the anecdotes that staff members keep for 30 years and, then, finally, tell at retirement dinners. William, at 4 and 5 and 6, was not performing royalty. He was just a boy. A boy who gave directions to lost footmen. Who waved at strangers because their faces were interesting and their being there felt like something worth acknowledging. Who wanted to know if the man's shoes hurt. The boy in Margaret Holloway's photograph, arm out the window, fingers spread, grinning at no one and everyone. She had the photograph developed at a chemist in Kensington the following Monday. She looked at it for a long time when it came back. Then, she put it in a shoebox. Not because it was unimportant. Because it was. Not the kind of important that belongs in a frame or a newspaper or an exhibition. The kind of important that lives quietly, in a shoebox, in an attic, waiting for the rare moments when someone needs reminding that the people we read about in history books were, once, simply people. Were once simply children. Were once small enough to lean out of car windows and wave at strangers for no other reason than that the strangers were there, and they were there, and waving seemed like the right thing to do. Nobody planned for the bee. That is the thing. Patricia Norris, head horticulturalist at Highgrove from 1984 to 1997, will tell you first, if you ask her about the afternoon of June 1989. Before she tells you anything else. Before she gets to the part with the wellies or the seedlings or the moment that made her laugh so hard she had to sit down on a wheelbarrow. Nobody planned for the bee, she says. And I think that's why I still think about it. Highgrove House in Gloucestershire is not, by royal standards, enormous. That is almost the point of it. After the ceremonial corridors of Kensington Palace and the granite immensity of Balmoral, Highgrove is the place that was always meant to feel like somewhere you could breathe. The gardens, especially Prince Charles, had spent years making them strange and personal and alive, the kind of gardens that reward the slow walker and punish the person who was only looking for the formal beds. By 1989, William was 7. 7 is an age of complete physical confidence and near total strategic incapacity. You can run fast, climb high, and squeeze through gaps that adults cannot follow you into. You cannot, however, be relied upon to predict consequences, respect boundaries that have not been explained at least 4 times, or walk past an interesting thing without stopping. William was in the garden on that June afternoon because a scheduled engagement had ended earlier than expected and the afternoon had opened up, unscheduled, in the way that afternoons occasionally do. His protection officer, a patient man named Davies who had been doing this long enough to know that unscheduled and uneventful are not the same word, was walking 3 paces behind him. Patricia was in the kitchen garden. She had been transplanting seedlings all morning, which is the kind of work that looks simple from a distance and is, in practice, extremely tedious and requires total concentration. She heard the wellies before she saw him. The sound of child-sized Wellington boots on a garden path is remarkably distinctive, a heavier, slappier sound than adult footsteps, with a rhythm that suggests the feet inside them are being lifted higher than is strictly necessary. She looked up. He stopped at the gate to the kitchen garden with the specific body language of a child who has just discovered something they were not previously aware existed. "What is that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. It was more the thing you say when your brain is still processing. "Kitchen garden," Patricia said. "Where we grow the vegetables." He looked at the beds, the neat rows of leeks, the sprawling courgette plants, the climbing beans on their cane frames, with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of where food comes from. "Those are actual vegetables," he said. "Yes. Growing in the ground. That's generally where they grow." He pushed the gate open and walked in the way that 7-year-olds enter spaces, without waiting to be invited but also without any particular aggression, simply as though the idea that he might need permission had not yet occurred to him. Davies stopped at the gate and leaned against the post, the body language of a man who has learned to identify the difference between a situation that requires intervention and a situation that merely requires vigilance. "Can I do one?" William said. He was standing in front of the seedling tray, looking at the small, impossibly fragile courgette seedlings that Patricia had spent the morning preparing. "Do one what?" "Transplant one. Into the ground." Patricia looked at him. Then, she looked at the seedlings she had been nursing for 3 weeks. She made a decision that she would later describe as either an act of faith or an act of temporary insanity, depending on her mood. "Wash your hands first," she said. "And be gentle. They're younger than they look." He washed his hands at the outdoor tap with the thoroughness of someone who has been told, many times, to wash their hands. Then, he came back and crouched down beside her and she showed him the hole, the right depth, the way you hold the root ball without squeezing, the way the soil goes back around it. He was quiet the whole time she was explaining. Then, he did it. Slowly. Carefully. His tongue between his teeth in that unconscious way children concentrate. The seedling went in slightly crooked. "It's crooked," he said. "It'll sort itself out," Patricia told him. "Plants are good at sorting themselves out." He sat back on his heels and looked at the seedling for a moment. "How long until it's a courgette?" "Few months." "Will you tell me when it is?" "I'll put your name on it," Patricia said. "So we know which one's yours." He looked up at her with an expression that was, she would say later, completely unguarded. "Really? Really?" The bee arrived approximately 4 minutes later. It came in low over the bean canes and made a direct line for the courgette seedlings, because bees have their own agenda and that agenda does not account for small princes crouching in kitchen gardens having formative experiences. It landed on the seedling directly next to the one William had just planted. He went completely still. Every 7-year-old has their bee protocol. Some run. Some cry. Some, having been stung before, adopt a philosophical approach that mostly involves very controlled breathing and not moving until the situation resolves itself. William's bee protocol, Patricia discovered, was to become a statue. He froze mid-crouch. Eyes fixed on the bee. Not terrified, she could see that. Just waiting. Negotiating, in some private internal way, with the bee. The bee investigated the seedling. The bee left. William exhaled. Then, he looked at Patricia with the expression of someone who has just survived something minor and is aware that the appropriate response is not to make a big deal of it but who also cannot quite contain how much of a big deal they privately feel it was. "Right," he said. "Right," Patricia agreed. Davies, from his position at the gate, appeared to be having some kind of internal experience he was professionally required not to express. They stayed in the kitchen garden for another 40 minutes. Patricia showed him the beans, how they climbed, why they needed the canes, the way the flowers came before the pods. She showed him the leeks and explained that they were mostly underground, which he found philosophically interesting in a way he couldn't quite articulate. She showed him the small wooden labels she used to mark what was planted where. He read every single one. He asked questions that were sometimes sensible and sometimes the questions of a person who was approaching a new subject entirely from first principles. Why do they have to be in rows? Can you grow a mango? What happens if you plant two things too close together? Do plants know they're in a garden? That last one she sat with for a moment before answering. "I think they know if they're happy," she said, finally. He nodded slowly, with the air of someone filing information away. When Davies finally appeared at his elbow to indicate that it was time to go in, William stood up and dusted off his knees and then turned back to look at the kitchen garden one more time. He found the seedling he'd planted. It was still slightly crooked. "Remember," he said. "You said you'd put my name on it." "I'll do it this afternoon," Patricia said. He nodded. Satisfied. He left the kitchen garden with the same unceremonious energy with which he'd arrived, the slapping wellies, the 3 paces of Davies behind him, the trajectory that suggested he was already thinking about the next interesting thing. Patricia did put his name on it. W on a small wooden label, pushed into the soil beside the crooked seedling. It grew. The courgette grew because courgettes, once they decide to grow, are essentially unstoppable, and this one had evidently decided, and it produced, by August, 4 courgettes of unremarkable size and perfectly good flavor. Patricia kept the label. She had no particular reason to. It was a piece of wood with a single letter on it. But she put it in the pocket of her work apron and, later that evening she moved it to a drawer in the potting shed where she kept things she didn't want to lose. She is retired now. She lives in a cottage outside Tetbury, 12 minutes from Highgrove, close enough to feel connected, far enough to feel free. The label is on her windowsill. W. She is asked, occasionally, by journalists and documentarians, what he was like. She always gives the same answer. He wanted to grow something, she says. He wanted to put something in the ground and know it was his and have his name on it. That's all. She pauses. I think that's not nothing. There is something about the things children care about. The specific intensity of a 7-year-old who has just planted his first seedling and wants to make very sure that nobody forgets which one is his. The private negotiation with a bee. The way a morning of questions, why Rose, can you grow a mango, do plants know they're in a garden, can feel more honest than 100 formal photographs. You can control what is photographed. You cannot control what is asked. You cannot control the moment a child crouches in a kitchen garden and gives the courgette seedling his undivided attention and holds his breath through a bee and wants, more than anything, to know that the thing he planted will be remembered. That it will have his name on it. that it will be his. Ask anyone who was at Ludgrove School in the autumn of 1990 what they remember about William Wales, and you will get a version of the same story. Not the same details. Details differ: the date, the weather, who else was there. But the shape of the story stays the same. Reliable the way only true things are reliable. He was 8. It was a Wednesday. He had just come off the football pitch with mud on his knees and a scrape on his left palm that was already beginning to bruise at the edges, and he was walking back toward the changing rooms when he saw the new boy sitting on the low wall outside the main building. Sitting alone. With the specific posture of a child who is trying to look like he is not bothered by being alone. Ludgrove School in Berkshire is the kind of English prep school that has its own particular atmosphere: old buildings, cold corridors, the particular institutional smell of floor polish and radiator dust that no amount of money ever quite eliminates. The boys wore dark trousers and gray shirts and moved around the grounds with the herd instincts of children who have learned, very quickly, which groups they belong to and which they do not. The new boy was named Thomas. He had started that week. He was from Surrey. He was 8 years old and he had never before been away from home, and he had been managing this fact by looking at a very specific point in the middle distance and concentrating on it very hard. William walked past him. Then, he stopped. Turned around. Sat down on the wall beside him. Thomas, who is in his 40s now and works as an architect in Bristol, remembers this with an accuracy that suggests he has turned it over in his mind many times. Not obsessively. The way you turn over things that mattered, to make sure they are still there. He just sat down, Thomas says. Didn't ask if he could. Just sat. And said, it gets better. Third week is fine. He pauses. And I thought, how does he know it's my first week? And then, I thought, of course he knows. Everybody knows when it's your first week. You can always tell. What William said next was not, apparently, a speech about resilience or adjustment or the importance of joining clubs and making friends. It was not a royal platitude performed for the benefit of an adult who might be watching. It was, are you good at football? Thomas told him he was all right. We need someone for our team tomorrow. Davies has gone home with tonsillitis. Thomas said all right. Right, William said, and stood up. And that was the end of the conversation. He didn't tell Thomas who he was. Thomas found out later that evening, from his dormitory mates, who delivered the information with the blend of reverence and matter-of-factness that English schoolchildren adopt toward people they see every day. That's William. Prince William. His mum's Princess Diana. Thomas thought about the boy on the wall. The mud on his knees. The straightforward way he'd sat down and asked a practical question about football. He just needed a player, Thomas says. That's all it was. He doesn't say this dismissively. He says it the way you say something that you have decided is the whole truth and requires no embellishment. He needed a player and I was available. That's all. But I've never forgotten it. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists at boarding school. It is not the sharp loneliness of being excluded. It is the slow, ambient loneliness of being in a crowd and still being entirely alone, of eating in a dining hall with 40 other children and feeling, underneath the noise, an almost geological isolation. Every child who has been to boarding school knows this loneliness. William knew it too. He had arrived at Ludgrove 2 years earlier, had sat through his own first week, his own first month, and had figured out, the way all children figure things out, which strategies work and which don't. The strategy that works, apparently, is sit down next to people. Ask them a practical question. Give them a thing to do tomorrow. It costs nothing. It weighs nothing. It is so small a gesture that the person doing it might not even recognize it as one. The person receiving it carries it for 30 years. The football match happened. Thomas played. He was, it turned out, more than all right. He had a good left foot and read the game well, and William, who was competitive in the uncomplicated way that 8-year-olds are competitive, was audibly pleased about this. Yes. Good pass. the uncomplicated shout of a child who was getting what he wanted. Thomas scored twice. The match ended in the specific chaos of school football, disputed offside, a minor altercation about whether a shot had crossed the line, general noise, eventual dispersal. William's team won. William appeared satisfied. They walked back toward the changing rooms. "Told you third week's better," William said. Thomas pointed out that it was only his first week. "Yeah," William said. "But, now you know someone." That is the moment Thomas comes back to when he tells the story. Not the football. Not the winning. Not even the original conversation on the wall. Now you know someone. 8 years old. Mud-kneed, scraped-palmed, walking across a school field in Berkshire in the autumn of 1990 with the total unconscious confidence of a child who has decided that knowing someone is the solution to most problems. It probably is. There is a photograph taken that autumn at Ludgrove, a school photograph, the kind taken every year, boys arranged in rows, youngest at the front, all facing the same direction with the slightly frozen expressions of children who have been told to hold still. William is in the third row. He is not holding still, quite. His chin is tilted a fraction to one side, as though something in his peripheral vision caught his attention at the crucial moment. His expression is not the composed, formal look of later official portraits. He looks like he is about to say something. Like there is a joke he is almost willing to risk telling. Diana kept that photograph on her dressing table. Not the grand official ones, not the formal portraits with the sashes and the ceremonial weight of centuries arranged carefully behind them. This one. The school photograph with the slightly crooked chin and the almost joke expression. Staff at Kensington Palace who entered her room remember seeing it there. It didn't have a significant frame. It wasn't positioned anywhere important. It was just there. The way the things that actually matter are usually just there, unpretentious, slightly out of alignment, catching the light at an odd angle. He was 8 years old in that photograph. And 10 years old on the first truly difficult day, and 12 on the day after that, and the childhood that he had at the waving from car windows and the kitchen garden seedlings and the quiet sitting down next to people, all of it was, in its way, preparation for a life that would ask extraordinary things of him. But, before the asking came the ordinary. The bees and the wellies and the mud on the knees. The lost footman and the tall clock and the door that smelled funny. The arm out the window, fingers spread, grinning at nobody, grinning at everybody. The boy who wanted to know if your shoes hurt. The boy who put his name on a seedling. The boy who sat down on a wall next to someone who was trying very hard to look like he wasn't lonely, and asked him a practical question about football, and said, as if it were simple, because to him, at 8 years old, it was simple, now you know someone. The thing about childhood is that it doesn't stay. It compresses, over time, into the things other people remember, the shoeboxes and the windowsills and the wooden labels and the walls outside school buildings. It lives in the people who were standing in the right place on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon and found, without warning, that they were part of a story they would be telling for the rest of their lives. Thomas still plays football occasionally, on weekends, with his son. His son is 8. When the boy has a bad day at school, the particular, low-grade, first-week kind of bad day, Thomas tells him what was once told to him by a mud-kneed boy on a low wall in Berkshire in the autumn of 1990. Third week is fine. And, now you know someone. That's all. That's everything.